So, hello everyone, this is Mahir Dhariwal. Welcome to yet another episode of Discourse, an archive of ideas, a series by the Economic Society of SRCC, geared towards broadening the horizons of discussions on policy issues. For today's discussion, we are joined by Mr. Karan Thapar, who needs no introduction, but he's a journalist whose brand of hard hitting reportage has left an indelible impact on Indian polity. With an illustrious career to his credit, having started from Nigeria and worked across a range of media houses till date. Sir has hosted a long list of widely renowned shows, including Line of Fire, War of Words, India Tonight, The Devil's Advocate, and many more. And he has been bestowed with multiple awards for his contribution to the Indian journalism. Currently, he's associated with The Wire and has been running a series of interviews with leaders from across the planet. It is an honor to have you with us, sir. So today, our discussion will revolve around, is the fourth pillar crumbling? A theme on which Sir is probably one of those positioned best to share insights on. Before we begin, please note that we will try to accept a few live questions as well. Whatever you want to ask, Sir, please type it on the chat box and we'll try to take a few at the end. Kindly ensure you're on mute for the entire duration of the session, including the Q&A session. So now to begin with, Sir, I would like to hear your opening remarks on the theme itself. Is media as the fourth pillar of democracy crumbling?
I don't think the media is crumbling, but I think it is true that the media is not fulfilling what we expect of it as effectively as it should. And let me begin by saying that there are elements of the media that are extremely good. This is true of a few television channels. This is also true of a few newspapers. However, there are a lot of popular television channels, a lot of popular newspapers that behave like lapdogs that want to get the favor and the goodwill of the government rather than watchdogs that growl at the government and defend the rights and liberties of the Indian people. We do not expose and embarrass the government. When the Prime Minister is interviewed, as he sometimes is by channels that are favorable to the government, they ask him questions that I would describe as lollipops. Rather than challenge him about things that have gone wrong under his watch, he's instead asked to comment on what the opposition is doing, thus giving him an opportunity to criticize them. Secondly, the Prime Minister indulges in very long, verbose, rambling answers that are by no means to the point and frequently don't answer the question, but never once is he interrupted. He's given this opportunity to set the agenda and to carry on, and virtually at times hijack the interview. That's very different to the way people from the opposition are questioned. As a result of which, the scrutiny that you expect the media to put the government under doesn't happen. The ability of the media to expose the underbelly of the government, its wrongs and its failings, doesn't happen. The need of the media to analyze and interpret what the government has done very rarely happens. It does occasionally, but very rarely. And as a result, we get a fair amount of reportage, but very little of understanding, very little of explanation, very little of expose, which is why I would say the media is not crumbling. That would be a mistake, but it's not behaving effectively. It's not fulfilling what we expect of it in terms of exposing and holding those in power to truth.
That is a very detailed explanation of what the current scenario of press freedom in India, if I may put it in that way, is. So to kick us off, I remember watching multiple old interviews of yours, sir, with Ram Jethmalani and the infamous interview with Narendra Modi as well. And compared to today's typical news media, I was quite surprised to see how direct and to the point those interviews were, while very meaningful. In your experience, what has changed since? Over the years, what has changed since when you were taking these interviews with Ram Jethmalani or Narendra Modi?
Well, look, let me begin by saying there are still a lot of anchors who do extremely good interviews. Rajdeep Sardesai is one. There are several like Srinivasan Jain on NDTV. These are, and by the way, there's Shireen Bhan on CNBC. These are people who uphold the duty of a journalist to question toughly, firmly, persistently, but of course, always politely. So, as far as good interviews go, there are some. But the general image of the media is that instead of questioning toughly, instead of probing deeply, instead of persisting so that when the government is embarrassed, you actually go further and expose the reasons why it's embarrassed, you have instead a whole plethora of journalists on a whole number of channels, and you don't need me to name those channels, where the government is treated with kid gloves. It's usually television discussions are not on subjects where the government is embarrassed or has performed badly, but on the response of the opposition, so that the opposition is in the dock and not the government. This desperate attempt, and I'm deliberately using those words, this desperate attempt not to hold the government up to trial, not to put it in the dock, but to find a way around the problems the government faces, is what I think is the big difference between an interview done by Rajdeep Sardesai, Shireen Bhan, Srinivas Jain, and the great majority of interviews.
Right. So while we're talking about these interviews, which were to the point, and a few other interviewers who are talking about who do interviews really well, according to you. So everyone is well versed with your rigorous style of interviewing. But in the interview you conducted with the former US President Barack Obama, that string of follow-ups and getting precise answers was somewhat absent. What challenges and pressures can a journalist face while interviewing such big leaders, and how can one get them to answer the questions that matter?
Well, first, let me explain that the interview with Barack Obama wasn't a normal interview in the sense I hadn't requested an interview, he hadn't agreed to it, it wasn't being done for The Wire or for a television channel. It was the opening and the star event of the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit, where he had agreed to be a guest at the Leadership Summit, and I had been invited by the Hindustan Times to interview him, but it was being done in front of a live audience, and it was being done to someone who had flown 9,000 miles from America to India for this occasion. And so it wasn't a strictly television journalistic interview. It was a chat with someone who'd agreed to come and talk. Secondly, and I've written about this extensively in my book, Devil's Advocate, what dismayed me about President Obama is that he had laid down fairly firm, rigid restrictions about what he could be asked and what he wouldn't be asked. He had, first of all, surprised me by asking for the questions in advance. I was reluctant to give them, but since I was a guest of the Hindustan Times and they were keen not to lose Obama, I sent the questions. He then responded by indicating which of the 16 he didn't want to be asked. And I said to myself, many of the 5 questions he doesn't want to be asked are really important questions relevant to an Indian audience. They're questions that the 1,000 or 2,000 people sitting in the room would really want to hear him. And so I said, regardless of his wish not to be asked those questions, I am going to go ahead and ask them. And I did. In practically every instance, he answered, but he didn't answer to the point. What he did was to use the opportunity to talk about something completely different. I could have brought him back to that subject 2, 3 times if I wanted to, but that would have been rude because this was a different sort of interview as I began, where he was an invited guest and I had been invited to talk to him, and it wasn't meant to be a journalistic exercise. But what it did do, and again, I've written about this, is in my eyes, suggest and show that Obama wasn't quite as great a man as I had thought. I walked out of that experience disillusioned. I still think very highly of Obama. I still believe he's one of the best political speakers. In fact, one of the best speakers, and I'm not going to qualify it by saying political, that I've ever heard. His recent book is delightfully written. But as a president who is president of America, who should be available to answer any and every question, I was disappointed that he was not willing to do so, that he actually went so far as to indicate what he didn't want to be asked and to actually specify, please drop these questions. That disillusioned.
Right. So, sir, very recently in the brutal Hathras incident, the government simply stopped access to media by imposing Section 144. Now, as students, we felt this sets a very wrong precedent in terms of criminal justice as well as administrative accountability. Now, is there any way we can prevent such instances in the future?
There are, I suspect, only 2 or 3 things we can do. One is to express public outrage at the way the government has behaved and at the denial of journalistic access to an area like Hathras, where we have a right to go and find out what is the truth. a right to go and meet and express our sympathies and concern with the victim and the victim's family for what happened to her. So public outreach is the first thing, and that public outreach can be expressed through newspapers, through television channels, through social media, but also through the general voicing in public of an opinion that we feel very deeply and strongly about. The second thing we could do, although I think it's very unlikely to happen, is that act in a coordinated fashion to ensure that such governments, not just the BJP government in UP, but such governments who do similar things in other states, are not re-elected, and therefore express our disillusionment and our anger by actually voting on voting day to ensure such governments are not re-elected. And I suppose the third thing we could do is to write to our MPs, write to them as constituents, write to them as voters, write to them as citizens of India to say this is unacceptable behavior. So that if they don't read the papers, they don't watch television, they are still made aware as MPs by their constituency that this sort of behavior is unacceptable.
Right, that is very insightful. Now, the conversation about ethics in news media has been growing with time with regards to objectionable and hatred inducing content. The only question we have here is if millions of people, as ratings and data depict, want to watch such content, is it fair to stop it?
No, it's not fair to stop people wanting to watch. You have to ask the other question. Should such stuff be given by television to people to watch? Uh, is the sole purpose of television to maximize its ratings by increasing eyeballs? And so, as a result of which, news channels show you endless Bollywood, endless cricket, and endless Hindu Muslim differences because they know that Indians are hooked to this. If that's the sole purpose, then let's turn around and say these aren't news channels. These are a form of entertainment channels that are giving us what we are already hooked to, a bit like a drug to make us addicts. But let's stop calling them news channels because a news channel has presumably a higher purpose, which is to inform, which is to educate, which is to analyze, which is to be balanced, which is to be objective, which is to be fair, which is to give other opinions a chance to be equally heard, and to give those who are being challenged or questioned or criticized a chance to defend themselves. All of that is an integral part of a news channel. But if it's not being done, or if it's being done in a one-sided and unbalanced way, then let's stop calling these news channels. So, of course, people have a right to watch what they want to within the parameters of the law. I'm emphasizing that as well. And there are arguments, good arguments, healthy arguments that can be had about where does the parameter of the law say thus far and no further. We have concerns about hate speech. We have concerns about provoking religious animosity, concerns about provoking caste animosity. Those concerns may not apply in the same way, and therefore they may not impinge upon free speech in the same way in Western countries. But then those are different countries. Each country will design and define the limits of the freedom of expression that it believes is healthy and permissible to reflect the concerns that country has, which are specific to that country. So you'll find that libel laws are much more effectively observed in the West because the courts come down very hard. Libel action is heard very quickly. The fines or the punishment is stringent. So libel is a huge concern in the West. In India, on the other hand, we can get away by libeling people on television and in the newspapers and nothing much happens. Literally, nothing much happens. But here, hate speech, provoking animosity, right, is a much bigger concern in a way it's not in the West. Those are all aspects of the limit to how far you can go that are designed to protect or to reflect the specificities of individual countries, individual societies. In our case, we're particularly conscious about religious animosity, caste animosity, sometimes even ethnic and region-based concerns. And within those, however, we do have the freedom. But channels need to ask themselves, what at the end of the day for a news channel, and I'm talking specifically about news channel, is more important? Balance, objectivity, fairness, honesty, accuracy, or winning eyeballs by treating audiences as addicts who should be given more of the drug that they are hooked to? That's a question channels have to ask themselves.
100% agreed. So now there has been a recent trend which has been observed, that is the rapid rise of digital media, a lot of which is based on subscription models. Now, of course, to be specific, social media has its own problems in terms of rampant fake news and misuse of platforms. What do you think this? How do you think this will play out?
When you say how will it play out, I take it the it is fake news on social media. Is that the right?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yes. Yes.
Well, the problem with fake news on social media is that social media is an open platform that anyone can access. There is no entry barrier. It's open to literally anyone who wants to be on Twitter or Facebook, Instagram, or any of the other platforms that social media makes available. And therefore, it's also available to people to air their views and say what they want. Initially, it was thought that this would enhance not just freedom of speech, but also the capacity of people to communicate with each other and make us both a broader, but also a more united world where we would be talking to each other. What people didn't realize, but this is now horribly clear, is that the same platform gives people an opportunity to actually mislead and lie, to tell untruths, and to not just tell them, but those untruths feed into groups of people that agree with them or think along those lines, and they further it by retweeting it. And so, what are clearly blatant lies and can easily be shown to be get accepted by millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, as if they are gospel truth. And in a sense, you're seeing this in America, where the power of President Trump and his 70 odd million followers on tweet and the power of the social media platform that he uses to proliferate and multiply the message is that loads of Americans believe that a fraud has taken place in the elections, that there has been, in fact, a denial or a stealing of the mandate, that President Trump is actually the real winner, Biden has stolen the election, and therefore there is outrage amongst those who believe it. But it's completely untrue. It's totally false. But because so many people believe it, and because the platform from which this message proliferates is so widespread, it becomes very hard to disprove this message. A lie for many people is becoming a fact and the truth, and yet you and I know it's not the truth, but it's very hard to disprove it.
Right. So basically, the very purpose of social media news is lost. So if we look on the opposite side of social media or digital media in a broader sense, we have the print domain. Maybe not in the short term, but do you think its importance might decrease in the long term? And if so, what kind of impact do you think this will have?
Well, whether print, broadsheet, or tabloid newspapers, things that you can hold in your hand and turn the page and feel and see, rather than a screen that you access, is going to be the medium by which we find out what's happened in the future, depends on two or three things. The speed with which access to mobile phones and computers and laptops spreads through society so that everyone has their own. And secondly, the facility with which people can operate these. Today, young people are extremely good at being able to operate keyboards and smartphones, a lot better than their parents, and definitely a lot more better than their grandparents. So the second of those concerns is getting taken care of with each and every generation. In due course, I imagine economic wealth would spread through countries, particularly in Africa and Asia, so that everyone ends up with a smartphone and everyone has their own laptop or computer. So the means by which you access this digital information will be there in everyone. That's not so today. The number of people with smartphones or laptops in India is very, very small. These may be very voluble people, and we may see and hear a lot about them on tweet and Twitter and Facebook, but the number is actually a very small number. However, and this is the interesting thing, whether even then this replaces newspapers depends upon the quality of the information this medium imparts and the extent to which people who receive it, you and me, believe it's accurate, true, reliable, trustworthy. We do have that impression of many newspapers. And even when you access information digitally, it tends to be from the websites of those newspapers. So we go to the New York Times, the London Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, right? Um, or the French papers, the Spanish papers, because they have a reliable reputation from their print avatar, which translates to their websites, which makes us go to them as credible sources of news. Or we go to new startups like The Wire or HuffPost or Quint, because these also have established a certain credibility. At the end of the day, even digitally, for something to be believed, it has to establish its credibility. That means it has to show that it is objective, it is fair, it is balanced, it is giving the other side a chance, an adequate and proper and fair chance to respond. When all of that happens, in effect, it's doing what the print traditionally ought to do. It's supplanting the print in that sense. But all of that has to come together for newspapers to cease to matter. I think the long-term trajectory is certainly going to be, as it seems today, I underline that, as it seems today, against newspapers. But I do think that newspapers are there for the foreseeable future. They're not disappearing in any recognizable time frame of period.
That's really interesting. So we have a question by Himanshu Chabda. So while promoting your book, you mentioned how London is a more civilized country and more private spaces given to the people. Why do you feel so?
Because it's a fact, is the short answer. You only have to go and live in England to discover the extent to which not only do you have privacy with your neighbors not prying into your lives or asking you questions or looking out the window to see who's coming and who's going, but people actually don't care. People really don't care what you're doing. It doesn't matter to them. In India, just think about it. Our neighbors keep an eye on us as much as they do on themselves. They're constantly looking out the window to say who's coming, who's going. Ah, he had a friend tonight. Oh, look who came for dinner. Acha, acha, wo to ladki aayi thi apne ghar rehne ke liye kal raat ko. It's just a fact of life. Uh, the British are great respecters of privacy. We in India, probably most of the time, don't understand what the word means. We make finding out about others and their lives our business. The Brits don't care about it. So the short answer, as well as the long answer, is it is a fact.
Right.
Now, when I
So
say
a
it's the most
new
civilized country, I'm not talking about 5,000 years of Indian civilization versus British history. Clearly, our civilization in that sense is a much older one. And I'm certainly not comparing the Christian tradition with the tradition of the Gita or the Upanishads or the Quran either. I'm simply talking about the attributes of modern day living that define civilizational values as we experience them in our day to day existence. And in those terms, Britain scores over India hands down.
right. So a new manner of opposing certain media outlets has been to demand that advertisers pull their content and so to stop the flow of cash. In your opinion, is this a fair tactic?
I don't think it's an unfair tactic either. At the end of the day, advertisers are run by companies or owned by people who reflect values. And you have to ask yourself, what sort of world do I want to promote? Do I want to pay for channels like Time News and Republic to spread hatred of minorities? Do I want to pay for channels to encourage cow lynching or to promote Hindutva over democracy? If I do, it's my choice. I'll pay for it. But if I profess that these are channels that I can't watch, that these are values that I don't agree with, and if I mean what I profess, then let's put my money where my mouth is and say, for a start, let's stop promoting this by funding it. It's a simple, easy decision. There's no,
Right.
it's very strange to say. Let me take a silly example to prove my point. It's very silly to say, I hate Nimbu Pani and keep drinking it. If you hate Nimbu Pani, don't drink it. If you hate Coca-Cola, don't drink it. There's no compulsion. But there's really no point in having a fourth Coke while claiming to the world that you hate the stuff.
Right. So right now we have 2 minutes, and to wrap things up, what is the future you see for Indian media, and how big a role can independent media play in that?
Well, it's interesting that you make a distinction between Indian media and independent media, because technically media is meant to be independent. All of Indian media ought to be independent. And the fact that you're distinguishing between the two suggests to me that there is a sizable section of Indian media that ceased to be independent and has become the puppy or the pet dog of the government. And that, if is the case, and I suspect it is true of many channels and some newspapers, is not just distressing and disgusting, it's actually deeply depressing as well. Do I see a future for the media? Of course I do. As I mentioned, there are some great anchors on Indian television. There are some great newspapers, the Hindu, the Indian Express in particular. There are others too on good days that do great stories. But the Hindu and the Indian Express, I would say, stand out in my mind. And I think these are papers that, if they can continue the way they are, will establish that Indian journalism at its best is as good as anything you will find in America, in Britain, in Germany, in France. At its worst, however, by the way, it's also true that we are as bad as the worst in the West, and in some senses even worse than that, because at least the West has a credible tabloid tradition, which, when you understand tabloids, is actually also a fairly remarkable tradition. India just has bad journalism. We don't have a tabloid tradition, we just have bad journalism.
Well, that really offers us tremendous insight into how we can envision the new future of the fourth pillar of our democracy. It has been a pleasure to have a conversation and learn from someone with your experience. We're grateful we're grateful to you for taking out time from your busy schedule and imparting knowledge to the entire student community. We can read all we want about journalism and the fight for truth, but hearing it from someone who's actually done it is a different experience. I'm sure the audience will agree with me there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.